Hello, everyone. It's Alvey presenting on the applicability of comorbidity indices to autistic adults. This is an exploratory study conducted by myself and Gregory Wallace. Autistic people disproportionately have comorbid conditions compared to neurotypical individuals. This results in generally higher medical costs and lowers the relative quality of life as determined by the autistic individual. Yet, there are no tools to quantitatively measure autistic comorbidity. Oftentimes, populations have either specified indices made for them or have had multiple broad indices applied to them. Neither has really been the case for the autistic population. To remedy some of this, we looked at 16 indices. Each index applied to a broad general population, either through their initial design or through follow-up data utilizing and validating them as a general measure. Indices included had novel discrimination methods, that being how many conditions they included and how they weighed the severity of said conditions. They also had to successfully predict at least one outcome, whether it be their primary measure or a measure identified in a future study. These generally included sampling and coding methods, primary measure, and condition distribution in terms of which functions of an index were analyzed. Certain elements had greater emphasis. Mortality by far was the most common primary measure, with mortality not only just being that, but also being a secondary measure of a lot of indices. Neurological conditions, out of the three conditions that impact autistic people the most, that being neurological conditions, gastrointestinal conditions, or psychiatric conditions, were preferentially chosen by index creators. Usually, indices base their conditions and their weighing on claims and studies. Often, studies were specifically conducted by them in other matters before then being utilized to create an index. Claims data is referring to insurance and can often be either in terms of large claims data, such as from Medicare, or hospital claims data. Hospitalized and geriatric populations were usually emphasized, especially geriatric populations. Multiple indices were initially developed for geriatric populations before being applied to general populations. Most conditions were defined as by ICD-9 and ICD-10 coding. In this, we found that indices can successfully vary in methodology. There was no best way to sample, there was no best way to define conditions, and no matter the path that these index took, they still were able to primarily measure a form of actuality or result occurring from comorbid conditions. Mortality was prioritized very heavily, with functioning taking a backseat but secondary role, with 30% of indices looking at functioning as the primary measure. Neurological conditions, especially those that are neurodegenerative, were emphasized by far. Some GI conditions were included, with most indices including one or two of these conditions. Comparatively, there were often indices that did not include any psychiatric conditions. Overall, we found that there is no best index to apply to autistic adults, but there are some candidates. The chronic illness rating scale considers the most common conditions of autistic adults. As well, it considers their general severity, making it on a graduated scale. The problem is due to the degree of specificity it requires, it's very hard to implement it in broad data sets. That meaning it can only apply to small samples. The Grohl Functional Comorbidity Index is interesting in terms of its emphasis of function versus mortality. This isn't in terms of just their primary measure, but also the way they frame questions, including a couple of outside measures beyond just the comorbid conditions. However, for a more traditional index, the multimorbidity weighted index is a great candidate, for it focuses on not just neurology, but also psychology, which was generally a rare finding. However, some GI conditions and some other conditions maybe weren't included. And so, though it is a good start, it may not be the best index. So, this presents future questions. First off, what do we gather from this? This really creates a foundation for future autism comorbidity indices, specifically looking at gaps such as psychiatric or GI conditions and areas for improvement in terms of the primary measure. This index could identify the aggregate quality of life, that being the total quality of life loss, depending on the number and severity of current conditions a person has. Overall, this would really simplify the landscape of autistic comorbidity. In general, comorbidity is a very complex topic, and usually conditions are interweaving in terms of their impact. This creates a much more simple landscape by presenting it in a quantitative way that can be more easily identifiable and actualize. This index could predict mortality rates and everyday functioning, but it can also look at things such as inter or independence and the quality of life. And especially this is really good for large population data, which may be more difficult to identify in many autism studies. This, as a result, creates a quantifiable multimodal approach for depicting really complex outcomes in a way that is generally simplified. And with that, I thank you all for being here. And moreover, I am thankful for this opportunity because hopefully with this results, we are able to either apply an index or create one of our own. And either way, we hope to, in general, provide some clarity in terms of the impact of comorbid conditions on autistic people. For future information, contact the George Washington University Lab of Autism and Developmental Neuroscience. And with that, I hope to see you guys at the conference soon. Bye.